My name is Rebecca Hubbard, and I will be presenting on the Nebraska Healthcare Funding Act of 2001 for Nursing 814 Healthcare Policy, Politics, Organization, and Cost at Fort Hays State University. By the end of this program, I will have discussed the following objectives. By giving a brief overview of the public health aspects of the Nebraska Healthcare Funding Act. I will touch on the history of public health legislation in Nebraska, identify the costs of this policy, and as Nebraska has a unique legislature, I will explain that briefly as we look at how this bill became a law. We'll also talk about the key parties in this program, those stakeholders, beneficiaries, and those adversely affected. Finally, I'll review my own recommendation for changes to this program. Let's begin. As many of you are aware, healthcare legislation is hardly ever a simple process. Often legislation includes several projects, and the Nebraska Healthcare Funding Act is no different. This is an omnibus legislation that included several other projects, including funding for nursing education programs. But today, or for my project, I wanted to really hone in on the public health implications of this act. Dennis Byers was the senator from Beatrice, Nebraska, who introduced LB 692, which was later approved as the Nebraska Healthcare Funding Act. A main part of this act established a statewide public health system within Nebraska. Funding for this program was paid for by the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. The best known part of the Master Settlement Agreement is probably the Truth.com campaigns. Some of you may remember that back in the late 1990s, there was a large class action lawsuit by several states against the American tobacco companies. States felt it was unfair to use the state's funds to pay for tobacco-related illnesses. When they won, tobacco companies agreed to pay a large amount annually to each state involved in the suit. Senator Byers and others felt the best way to use the tobacco monies was to invest in public health in Nebraska. The section of the act that pertains to public health created 16 public health departments across the state from groups of counties, as well as defined the core functions and the scope of public health, as you can see here. I do want to backtrack just for a moment and talk briefly about the history of public health policy in Nebraska. So soon after Nebraska attained statehood in 1867, the legislature authorized cities of more than 3,000 to establish local boards of health. These boards were charged with managing public health concerns and received limited funding from the state, instead utilizing local taxes as funding sources. In the 1930s, responsibility for public health activities shifted to the county health departments with overview by a state board of health. However, programs still relied heavily on their local or county tax income as well as grants for funding. In 2001, LB 692 was proposed in the Nebraska unicameral to dedicate funding to local health departments. So initially, the state received about $50 million from the Tobacco Settlement Agreement. When enacted, $12 million was utilized for public health. Nebraska is a single-house legislative system, so Byers was able to introduce LB 692 directly to the legislature, or the unicameral as we call it. However, it was referred to both the Appropriations Committee and the Health and Human Services Committee for recommendation before being passed. Now, as you can see here, both groups weighed in and made changes to the original bill, citing certain stipulations that they wanted an accounting of the aid distribution and an annualized report, Health and Human Services really wanted to talk about those core functions, the public safety, and how we're going to evaluate the processes. Now, when reintroduced back to the House for a final vote, LB 692 did pass unanimously. Recall that the initial funding for this bill came from a lawsuit that was premised on the unfair burden tobacco-related illnesses placed on states. Therefore, tobacco users could be considered a key stakeholder. Public health departments really are essentially community providers for many with low socioeconomic status. So that really makes those people, again, key stakeholders, as well as those healthcare providers that are serving those communities. Most Nebraskans did benefit from a coordinated public health effort. An annual report of the activities has to be submitted each year to the Office of Community Health and Performance Management in October. The goal of any public health policy really is to increase the health and well-being of the population, and the Healthcare Funding Act goes a long way towards promoting that goal. However, disparity does still exist. Despite funding of the local public health departments, the Act did specify population requirements for counties receiving funding from LB 692. One county in Nebraska, so 1 in 93 counties, does not qualify for funding under these statutes. It's Dakota County in northeast Nebraska. It does have its own health department, but it does not receive funding for its programs under LB 692. The omnibus legislation of Nebraska Healthcare Funding Act led to the development of 16 local health departments. But again, Dakota County did not meet those population requirements. Amending the act to include Dakota County may be the way of including this or including it within that Northeast Nebraska Public Health Department area. I was really unable to find any reason in my research beyond the population requirement why Dakota County doesn't participate. So it might be interesting to do some sort of community awareness survey or action survey because they do have their own public health department. They just don't, again, receive that sort of funding to find out, if that group of the population wants to be included. Another key change that I would really suggest is the standardization of projects along the state. While some projects do happen in all locations or in all 16 of those public health departments, some projects are more individualized or some areas focus more on one thing than they do the other. This is according to the director of the Two Rivers Public Health Department, which is covers the area where I live. Each department does submit an annual report on what they have been doing, but they're also free to pursue additional objectives beyond the state mandated concerns. While this is certainly good because it serves to individualize, again, to the population of each particular district, there then can also be gaps in programs that serve the basic needs of all populations that may not be met. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to view my presentation today. Here, of course, is a list of my resources used in my policy and practice, PowerPoint, and subsequent paper. Again, thank you for your time today. Have a great summer.